This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
My name is Chuck Smuckler. I'm with Global Health Sciences, and I have the pleasure of filling in for Chris Stewart, the program coordinator, to introduce tonight's speaker, Sir Richard Feacham. Professor Feacham is, I think you're going to find to be a real pleasure and a great opportunity to sit in the audience and hear his presentation and watch the shrinking map of malaria. I was just joking with somebody, and we talked. Some of us have seen some of these presentations, and we're convinced that each time the presentation is made, the map gets smaller and smaller in terms of malaria, meaning the programs are successful. Let me just read very quickly from the bio here and not take away from Dr. Feacham's presentation. Sir Richard is a professor here at UCSF and at UC Berkeley, and a professor in global health. He's the director of the Global Health Group here within Global Health Sciences. From 2002 to 2007, he served as the founding executive director for the Global Fund to end AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And this is a huge task, a task that started with zero money in the bank and became a huge program. I think the figure was $11 billion. So you have a person who has a wonderful overview of health across the world and the global health issues. Professor Feacham holds a Doctor of Science degree in medicine, a PhD in environmental health, and an honorary doctorate in engineering. And he's a man who's had experience. I was in his office, and there's a picture of him actually in shorts in some jungle scene where I believe he was testing water. And so he has the kind of experience that's very real world on the ground to very real world within the very complex international scene. Dr. Feacham, please.
Let's start in the recent past, October the 17th, 2007. And on that day, at a remarkable meeting in Seattle hosted by the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates made a number of statements. Really, they made a call to arms about malaria eradication. And you have there a couple of quotes from Bill: "We're not done, and we will not stop working until malaria is eradicated." Very bold statement. And from Melinda: "To aspire to anything less is just far too timid a goal for the age we're in." Now, for those of you who know a little bit about malaria, you will appreciate that that is a quite remarkable call to arms. Because for 30 years, the E words, eradication, and the other E word, elimination, could not be spoken in polite company. you would have to wash your mouth out and leave the room and apologize profusely. These were not acceptable words, because the eradication campaign of the 1950s and 1960s had been deemed to be a failure, incorrectly in my view. I don't think it was a failure, but it had been deemed to be a failure. And therefore, through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and up until 2007, in fact, one could not speak of eradication in malaria circles without being branded as a hopelessly naive optimist. But Bill and Melinda made this public commitment. Others joined behind them, quite correctly. And the world is now engaged in a far more ambitious program against malaria, not merely to control it, but to, in fact, eradicate it. That will take 50 years, 60 years. It won't be quick. Maybe we'll do it by 2050. Maybe we'll do it by 2060. It'll take a while. But I and a number of others believe that it can, in fact, be done. And this call to arms has raised our level of ambition very dramatically. What does eradication mean? It means doing for malaria what we did for smallpox. No more human malaria on the planet. There will still be a lot of other malaria in other vertebrate species, but there will not be human malaria. That's what we mean by eradication. We did it for smallpox. We're about to do it for polio, inshallah. But we've so far only done it for smallpox, and this is a goal of doing it for malaria. Now, let's just remind ourselves of a little bit of the history of malaria. Malaria is one of the most ancient recorded diseases of humankind. You can find accounts of malaria in ancient Chinese literature going back 4,000 or 5,000 years. And we know from genetic studies that the malaria parasite has been in Homo sapiens for tens of thousands of years. This is a very, very ancient parasitic infection of humans. And until the 1890s, in other words, until 110 years ago, until very recently, it was associated with people who live in low-lying, swampy places. And the name malaria comes from bad air. It was thought to be caused by the inhalation of miasmas, dangerous substances, contained in fetid, damp air, such as would be breathed in by people living in low-lying, swampy places. Now, we know scientifically today that there is an association between malaria and low-lying, swampy places, but we know that that's not because of the inhalation of some bad substance in humid, heavy air. We have learned that fairly recently, and the particular breakthrough was, of course, the work of Ronald Ross, Major Ronald Ross of the Indian Army Medical Corps, Dr. Ronald Ross, later Sir Ronald Ross, a British officer in the Indian Medical Service, a poet, a scientist, a mathematician, a novelist, a painter, and a musician, who in 1897 discovered at his small laboratory in India that the parasite that causes malaria is in fact transmitted by females of the mosquito genus Anopheles. So female Anopheles mosquitoes transmit malaria, he discovered, which was a remarkable discovery and set previous understandings completely on their head. Previous understandings had been quite different. For this discovery, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1902. We've just had the recent round of Nobel Prizes, including one to UCSF, and another one to Berkeley, which is very good news for the University of California. But the first Nobel Prize for a Brit, given to a Brit in any subject, was to Ronald Ross, and the second Nobel Prize for medicine was to Ronald Ross. Interestingly, there have been 4 other Nobel Prizes for malaria, one to the French army doctor, Alphonse Laveran, who discovered the parasite, working in Algeria. The third to the person who discovered the insecticidal properties of DDT, a chemical that we're now once again using more and more in the fight against malaria. And the fourth one, interestingly, for the discovery that a way to treat advanced syphilis is to deliberately infect the patient with malaria to produce a very high fever, which will deal with the advanced syphilis. Now, luckily, we don't do that anymore. We have antibiotics to deal with syphilis, advanced and otherwise. But before the days of antibiotics, one of the treatments was to deliberately infect the syphilitic patient with malaria. And that was considered such a breakthrough at the time that it actually won a Nobel Prize. So there have been 4 Nobel Prizes for malaria so far. Doubtless there will be more before the task is completed. And if you look back and read Ronald Ross's original writings, this is a quotation from his Nobel acceptance speech in Stockholm in 1902, he believed in eradication. His early understanding is that we could eradicate malaria, and he wrote about that. Now let's just get a couple of definitions straight. Eradication, I've already defined for you. It means no more human malaria. It's important to say no more human malaria, because almost all land and air vertebrates, almost all land vertebrates and many, many birds have their own malaria, transmitted by, generally speaking, Anopheles mosquitoes, and we're not trying to eradicate those forms of malaria. We're trying to eradicate human malaria. There are 4 kinds of human malaria, of which 2 predominate. So our focus is mainly on those 2. The other E word we need to define is elimination. And that is the word we now use to mean local eradication. Getting rid of malaria in my country would be called elimination. So what the United States did in 1952, which was at the time called eradication, because there was a lot of malaria in the United States prior to 1952. But in 1952, the United States got rid of malaria, and today we would call that elimination. So elimination is local eradication, eradication from a particular geography, usually a country. And in my talk this evening, I'll use elimination completely to mean eradication from a country, while there is still malaria elsewhere in the world. Now, I don't want to turn this into a biology lesson, but just to remind you that malaria is a very complex disease. It's caused by parasites of the genus Plasmodium. In humans, particularly 4 species of that parasite, and particularly 2 species, Plasmodium falciparum and Plasmodium vivax. It has a complex life cycle, both in the human and in the mosquito. And that's a very important piece of its biology. The mosquito is not just a mechanical vector moving infected blood from one person to another. The mosquito is part of the biological life cycle of the parasite. The mosquito is infected, and the parasite has to develop into new and different forms in the mosquito in order to be infectious on the next occasion when the mosquito will bite a human. And this complexity of the parasite is both an advantage and a challenge. The advantage is that it gives us many points for intervention. When something is as complicated as that, you can try to intervene to break this cycle of disease and transmission at many different points. But in addition, its complexity makes it challenging because it has many ways to evade and avoid the technologies that we throw against it. Here's the fat lady. And not any fat lady, our own, very own fat lady. Because this is the female of Anopheles freeborni. Only female Anopheles drink blood, and therefore only female Anopheles transmit malaria. And this is the major malaria west of the Rocky Mountains. From Southern California to midway up British Columbia, up the whole Pacific coast. This is our main malaria vector. And in the evening, in a summer evening, if you sit outside in Alameda or Contra Costa, where there used to be quite a bit of malaria, you'll get bitten by mosquitoes a little bit. And some of those may be Anopheles freeborni. So she is still with us. She hasn't gone away. The vector of malaria is still around. And that's true of all places which have eliminated malaria. They've eliminated the parasite, not the mosquito. The mosquito is still there and can transmit the parasite again if she meets humans who are infected. She can become infected, and she can move that parasite then to other humans. And that's why we not only have imported cases in California, we actually have little outbreaks in California from time to time. We have little clusters of cases where somebody comes into California, typically from countries to the south, infected with malaria, and we don't only get the single imported case, we get a little cluster of cases because it's in the summer and they get bitten and they transmit to others. We call that secondary cases. And that little outbreak doesn't occur often, but it does occur from time to time. The largest outbreak in the United States since elimination in 1952 was in California, just north of San Diego. And there were over 30 cases. So it really was a little outbreak caused by an imported case and then spreading to others. Now, the other nice thing about the fat lady in the slide is that she's not only our local vector, but she is the University of California's local vector. Because the reason she's called Anopheles freeborni is that she was discovered by Professor Freeborn. And Professor Freeborn was the first chancellor of the University of California at Davis. So we have some ownership of this anopheline vector of malaria. Now, of course, the majority of malaria in the United States, particularly in the last years leading up to the elimination in 1952, was in the 13 states of the lower Mississippi Valley. So it was the southeast of the country, the deep south, that had the big burden. And we'll talk more about that later. So how are we going to get from a malarious world today to a malaria-free world? What is our eradication strategy? And the answer is on this slide. It's a three-part strategy. Part one is aggressive control in the heartland. We've heard from some heartland countries. Kenya is a heartland country. Ethiopia is a heartland country. Most of tropical Africa are heartland countries with high burdens from malaria, high levels of transmission, typically, and there the current effort is to aggressively control to reduce the burden of death and disease. And the burden of death and disease is very large. There are many African countries where malaria is either a leading cause or the leading cause of death in under 5-year-old children. It can be responsible for up to 30% of all deaths in under 5-year-old children. It is a big child killer in the humid tropics, the lowland humid tropics in Africa. As you go uphill, there's less and less malaria. And at 2,000 meters, it essentially cuts out, maybe 2,500 meters. So that's part one of the strategy. Part three of the strategy, I'm going to jump to the bottom now, is research. And we badly need that research to bring forward better drugs, better diagnostics, a vaccine and another vaccine and a better vaccine and a better vaccine, and so on. The research enterprise that UCSF is much engaged in is very important. Today's tools are very good. We can do a lot with today's tools. But we can't do everything with today's tools. And also today's tools will run out of steam because the parasite will become resistant to the drugs. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. The parasite will eventually become resistant to the drugs, and the mosquito will eventually become resistant to the insecticides. So we need new generations of drugs. We need to stay ahead of resistance. And we need new generations of insecticides. So that's one reason for the research. And we need more powerful tools. We need better and easier drugs. We need better and easier to use diagnostics. And at the moment, we don't have a vaccine at all. In 3 or 4 years' time, we'll have the first vaccine, quite certainly, I think. But it will only be very partially efficacious. So we'll need to go beyond that to get a better vaccine and a better vaccine. So research is very important. And part one of the strategy really took off in 2002 with the formation of the Global Fund. And the Global Fund has now put billions of dollars into malaria across about 90 countries. And that has been the real driving force for the big scale-up of malaria control programs across the developing world. At about the same time, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation began to ramp up very rapidly their investment in malaria research. Drugs, vaccines, diagnostics, other things. So parts 1 of the strategy and 3 of the strategy have received a lot of attention and have been increasingly well funded since about 2002. We always call for more money. There's never enough. But the fact of the matter is that funding for part 1 and 3 of the strategy have increased exponentially since 2002. Part 2 of the strategy is what's been neglected. Progressive elimination from the endemic margins inwards to shrink the malaria map. And that's what I'm going to talk about this evening, shrinking the malaria map. So let's look at malaria maps. And let's start 2 or 3 years after Ronald Ross discovered that malaria was transmitted by mosquitoes. So before we had done anything, because until we knew that, we couldn't do anything. We were working in the dark. We could drain a swamp or two, like the Romans did, and observe that malaria went down outside Rome. We could do that, but that was very haphazard. That was very hit and miss. We needed to understand enough about the biology to actually do something purposeful. And by 1900, we had that knowledge, and so this is the beginning of deliberate attempts to do something. And what did the world look like in 1900? Well, every red country on this map has endemic malaria transmission somewhere within its borders, and every green country doesn't. So who doesn't? Well, Greenland doesn't, and Iceland doesn't, and Switzerland doesn't, but it did previously. Mongolia doesn't, high and dry. Lesotho doesn't, high and dry. And Uruguay doesn't, and I have no idea, don't ask me. But they claim they didn't have it. But everyone else had it. And the message from this slide is that malaria was a global disease. We forget that. We think malaria has always been a tropical thing. Malaria has not always been a tropical thing. Malaria has been a global thing. And you see that here. Now, this does not mean that every part of every red country had malaria. It means that in significant areas, not everywhere necessarily, of every red country, there was endemic malaria, and therefore we could call this a malarious country. And it went very far north. In Canada, for instance, it went up in the summer where I'm pointing now. In Russia, it was transmitted every summer right up here at Murmansk and Archangel, those ports which were used by the Allies during the Second World War to supply the Soviet army because they kept ice-free for most of the year. North of the Arctic Circle, malaria transmission every summer. Remarkable, but that was the case. And in fact, there were only 2 limits to the geographical spread of malaria. The first was temperature. Malaria lives in a warm-blooded animal, us, and a cold-blooded animal, the mosquito. When the malaria parasite is in us, it doesn't matter if we're walking across an ice field because we're at 37 degrees. So the parasite inside us is at 37 degrees and is quite happy and is going on with its biological life cycle. But when the parasite is in the mosquito, it's at the ambient temperature, because the mosquito is at the ambient temperature. And it can't complete its life cycle if the temperatures fall too low. And so the major barrier to malaria transmission is the summer temperature. And if the summer temperature is too low, you don't get malaria transmission in the summer. And the cutoff is around 65 degrees Fahrenheit. If you don't get a few weeks of daytime temperatures above 65 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer, you don't establish endemic malaria. And our surrogate for temperature is high altitude and high latitude. So if you start on the equator and you want to escape from malaria, you've got two options. You can walk a long way north, and eventually you'll get north of it because you'll be at a very high latitude. Or you can walk a long way south and get to a very high latitude. There's no malaria in Antarctica. Or you can walk up a mountain. Same thing. And if you walk up Mount Kilimanjaro, some of you may have done that, when you get above about 2,200, 2,300 meters, you're above malaria. Why? Temperature. The amount of time above about 65 degrees Fahrenheit is not sufficient for the life cycle to be completed. So that's one major barrier. The other major barrier is this gentleman here that I'm pointing to, Professor Patrick Buxton of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And he discovered a biogeographical discontinuity which bears his name, the Buxton line. Now, I've also put on this map the Wallace line, which is the best known of all biogeographical discontinuities. Hands up people who know who Wallace was and what the Wallace line is. Well, Alfred Wallace, later Sir Alfred Wallace, was the co-discoverer of the theories which were published 150 years ago by Charles Darwin. So On the Origin of Species, which was Darwin's book, and this year, as you know, we celebrate the 200th anniversary of the birth of Charles Darwin and the 150th anniversary of the publication of On the Origin of Species, where he set out the theories of natural selection and evolution. His co-worker in that endeavor was Alfred Wallace. Unfortunately, 150 years ago, when Darwin was launching his book in London, Alfred Wallace was wandering around what in those days were called the Spice Islands. Today we'd call that Indonesia, and discovered the line that is named after him. And it's a fascinating line because, if I can point to it, there we go. There it is. Because roughly speaking, to the west and north of that line, there are rhinoceri. On the other side of the line, no rhinoceri. To the west and north of the line, there are primates, monkeys and apes. On the other side of the line, no primates. To the west and north of the line, there are cats. On the other side of the line, no cats. On the east and south of the line, an amazing variety of marsupials of a weird and wonderful nature. And the other side of the line, no marsupials. My favorite of all marsupials, which I lived with in Papua New Guinea, is the tree kangaroo. And if you think of an animal designed by a University of California committee, it would be the tree kangaroo, the bizarrest animal. It is a kangaroo that lives in a tree. And if you think of a kangaroo and you think of where it is not well adapted to live, you might think of a tree. Well, a tree kangaroo is indeed a kangaroo. It looks like a kangaroo, and it lives in a tree. And it's an extraordinarily clumsy, slow-moving, and kind of bungling animal. And it would survive for a nanosecond if there were any cats around. But there are no cats around. So it survives in the jungles of Papua New Guinea and West Irian. And with many, many other very bizarre marsupials. Those of you who've studied the fauna of Australia will be familiar with these animals. And they do not exist to the north and west of the Wallace line. So that is a biogeographical discontinuity. It's a line on the map where on one side you get one flora and fauna, and on the other side you get another flora and fauna. And the differences can be dramatic even in a very short distance. Now, I tell you the Wallace story because the Buxton line is another lesser-known biogeographical discontinuity, to the west of which there are Anopheles mosquitoes, and to the east of which there are none until you get to San Francisco. So between the Buxton line and San Francisco, there is no anophelism. There are no Anopheles mosquitoes. Therefore, no malaria. So I said there were two limitations to malaria: temperature, which I talked about, and Patrick Buxton. Because in the huge stretch of the globe between his line and the west coast of North and South America, there are no Anopheles, therefore no malaria. So those of you who know the geography of the Pacific will know that we have Micronesia, where I'm now pointing, the small islands, if you translate from the Greek, the small islands. There is Polynesia, which is out here and here, including Hawaii, the many islands, and Melanesia, where I'm pointing here, the Black Islands. And Melanesia has malaria because it's west of the Buxton line, and Micronesia and Polynesia do not, including, of course, New Zealand, which is part of Polynesia. So those were the geographical limits of malaria. It was everywhere, with a very few exceptions that I've just mentioned. Let's fast forward. Oh, those are the 60-degree Fahrenheit July isotherm in the northern hemisphere and January isotherm in the southern hemisphere. I show that to illustrate how far south and how far north malaria could go in temperature terms. So let's come forward 45 years, and the question is, what's the difference? So those of you of a Scandinavian leaning will immediately identify that Norway and Sweden have managed to eliminate in the intervening period, but nobody else has. The world looks exactly the same. So in the first half century of knowing the biology of the disease, only Norway and Sweden eliminated. That's remarkably little progress. Why? I think primarily because there were 2 world wars during that period. And the history of malaria and the history of war are very, very interconnected. And malaria does very well in times of instability, conflict, and war. Malaria was a huge cause of mortality among armies in the First World War and the Second World War. I'll say more about that later. And that was not just in the tropical theaters of war. In the Italian campaign in the summer of '43, I guess, huge morbidity and mortality among both German and Italian troops on one side, and American, British, Indian, Australian, and many other troops on the other side during that slow, mile-by-mile advance up the Italian peninsula. Malaria was a big cause of morbidity and mortality. And wars set malaria control back enormously. In times of war and instability, malaria tends to surge forward, and I think the 2 world wars are a significant reason why, by 1945, we'd made such little progress. But by 1970, we've made a lot of progress. So Canada and the United States have gone green. Western Europe has gone green. Israel's gone green. Japan has eliminated. Taiwan has eliminated. That was a huge achievement. Hong Kong has eliminated, a huge achievement. Singapore has eliminated, a huge achievement. Big progress towards shrinking the malaria map already by 1970. Some of the highlights of that, please. Yeah, very good question. So why were they such significant achievements? Firstly, they're in the humid tropics. So they have those climatic conditions which promote high mosquito numbers, high transmission, lots of biting. It's harder to eliminate malaria in the humid tropics than in temperate parts of the world. They had year-round transmission and lots of mosquito capacity to transmit, firstly. Secondly, during this period, between 1945 and 1970, these were poor countries. These were not the Asian tigers that we know today with the high GNPs per capita. These were very poor countries creating themselves. Taiwan creating itself from out of conflict and strife. Singapore breaking away from Malaysia and creating itself as a country. So difficult times in which to do something of this kind. And the third challenge was, in the case of Hong Kong and Singapore, not so much Taiwan, an enormous movement of people from their malarious neighbors, particularly in the case of Singapore. Between 1945 and 1970, Singapore was a giant construction site. What you see today was being built, or partly being built, during that period. And of course, a lot of laborers had to be brought in to allow that construction to occur. And those laborers came in from endemic malarious areas and would have brought in malaria with them. So these are the kinds of challenges they faced. And so these were remarkable achievements, and the history of how that was all done is remarkable. I'll tell you one Singapore story. The government of Singapore realized that during this construction boom that was going on, the building sites themselves, the construction sites, were prime malaria transmission foci. Because in construction sites, you have large holes on the ground, and it rains a lot. So they fill with water. You get a lot of mosquito breeding in construction sites. So the Singapore government, being as it is, they passed a law that made it illegal for construction companies to allow Anopheles breeding on their construction site. And the government inspectors then didn't have to control the breeding on the construction sites. They had to police the breeding on the construction sites, which is much easier. All they had to do was go and inspect. And if they found Anopheles breeding on a construction site, they would fine the construction company. It was the fault of the construction company because they weren't applying the chemicals and the drainage and the anti-mosquito measures that they should have been applying. So that was a great example of how you can transfer the task to others and create incentives, powerful incentives, for other people to do what they should do while the government can do its part in parallel. Other interesting stories, I've mentioned the United States. The United States got rid of malaria in 1952, and the last battleground was where I'm pointing, the lower Mississippi Valley. Now, you've all woken up in the middle of the night worrying about the question, why is CDC in Atlanta? Think of the large federal agencies that you know. They're not in Alabama. They're not in the Deep South. But CDC is one of the most important large federal agencies. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is in Atlanta, Georgia. Why? The answer is because it used to be called Malaria Control in War Areas. That was its original name. And it was established to finish the job of eliminating malaria in the United States. And the federal government was quite smart. It said, let the agency responsible be in the middle of the battle. Put the agency where the problem is, not far away. And so it was in Atlanta. And that's why CDC is in Atlanta today. And they had two problems to face. One was high levels of malaria transmission among poor farmers. This was a disease of poor farmers in the South. It wasn't a disease of the wealthy. It wasn't a disease of the urban population. It was a disease of poor farmers, which is true today in Africa and many parts of the world. Malaria focuses on the rural and the poor. That was true in the southeast of the United States as well. But also, there are many army camps, there are many garrisons, there are many military establishments in that part of the United States. And throughout the Second World War and at the end of the Second World War, American troops were coming home to their barracks from malarious areas. So maybe they were coming home from the Pacific Theater of War, where I'm now pointing, and they were coming home and being stationed here, and they were bringing malaria with them. So you had an endemic malaria situation with this constant re-importation of malaria by returning soldiers. So it was a dual challenge. It was aggressively addressed immediately the war ended, from 46 onwards, and by 52 the job was done. And malaria was declared absent from the United States. Europe was very interesting. The last cases in the United Kingdom, malaria in the United Kingdom stretched roughly up to Birmingham, if you know the geography of the United Kingdom, roughly up to Birmingham. The worst areas were East Anglia, to the east of Cambridge. East of Cambridge, if you know the geography, there's an area called the Fens. This is a low, swampy area. And if you read Victorian romantic novels, the heroine will retire to her room with fen ague, A-G-U-E. That was malaria. That's what the heroine had when she fainted and retired to her room with a fever and couldn't meet the handsome caller on his horse. That's fen ague. The last cases of transmission in the United Kingdom were early, mid-1950s. The stubborn places were Greece, Italy, Spain, and the last one was Greece. Elimination from Greece was 69, 70. That was the last from this portion of Europe. Turkey did not follow suit, did not eliminate, and still hasn't. There is still endemic malaria in Turkey, as we'll see. So let's come forward to 1990, and we've made a lot of progress. Chile eliminated in the period between 1970 and 1990. Coming further north, you will see that the Caribbean has eliminated, except for the island of Hispaniola. So except for the Dominican Republic and Haiti, the Caribbean has gone malaria-free. In North Africa, Tunisia has gone malaria-free. Good news for all scuba divers, the Maldives has gone malaria-free. You can now scuba dive without taking mefloquine, which for those of you who have had those nightmares that you get from mefloquine will know is a really good idea. Australia, 1982, one of the last wealthy countries to eliminate malaria, 1982. But the big news is here, because what you see here is the Soviet Union malaria-free. Anyone remember the Soviet Union? Is that a distant recollection? The Soviet Union fought malaria tooth and nail since about 1930, and before 1990 had eliminated it from the entire borders of the Soviet Union. A massive achievement, a massive achievement. The Koreas, both of them, had gone malaria-free. So that was the progress, a lot of progress. Come to today. I'll do that again because it's kind of interesting. Okay, we see some forward movement and some backward movement. I hope you all spotted the backward movement. The forward movement is really North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. So Morocco, Western Sahara, Libya, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, sorry, up here, the United Arab Emirates, Syria, thank you. What am I missing? So those were the achievements. They also went malaria-free by today. But a number of countries went in the opposite direction. Firstly, 4 of the 5 Central Asian stans, not Kazakhstan, the big one here, although Kazakhstan did have re-established malaria for a while, but then quickly got rid of it. So if we come to today, Kazakhstan malaria-free. But the other 4 stans, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, re-established endemic malaria. So did the Trans-Caucasus 3 countries, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. Endemic malaria re-established. Why? That's a significant movement in the wrong direction, which is a characteristic of malaria. If you take your eye off the ball, malaria comes back. 2 reasons. One is, as you well know, when the Soviet Union collapsed, many of the poorer parts of the Soviet Union, which suddenly found themselves as independent republics, went downhill economically very, very rapidly. Government became dysfunctional, and public health systems run by the government collapsed. So there was a health crisis in the Soviet Union, and that health crisis was most strongly expressed in the smaller republics, where the public health system that had been controlling malaria and eliminating malaria and keeping malaria out fell to pieces, and malaria came back. The other reason is exactly analogous to what I said about the southeastern United States in 1952, returning soldiers. Do you remember in 1989, the iconic film footage of tens of thousands of Soviet troops exiting Afghanistan? The Soviet army gave up in Afghanistan and left. It's going to happen to us in the not too distant future, but in 1989 it happened to somebody else. It happened to the Soviet army. And they exited across the so-called Freedom Bridge, across the Oxus River, and they were stationed in army camps in the southern republics. And in northern Afghanistan particularly, there is malaria transmission. So those large numbers of Soviet troops who were stationed in Afghanistan, some of them had malaria, and brought it back to their barracks, to their army camps in the southern republics. And that, plus the breakdown of the public health systems after 1990, when the Soviet Union broke up, re-established endemic transmission in the southern republics. The ecology and epidemiology of malaria differ in different parts of the world. There are similarities, but there are differences. The differences are of 2 main kinds. One is simply how much of it is there. Are you starting from a very high malaria situation or from a much more modest malaria situation? And part of that difference is seasonality. Are you dealing with year-round transmission, or are you dealing with seasonal transmission? So that's one major difference. Of course, it's much easier to deal with seasonal transmission than year-round transmission, and it's much easier if you start with low transmission than if you start with very high transmission. The other big difference is in the mosquito, because there are something like 80 Anopheles species, 20 primary ones, but probably 80 in total, that transmit malaria. And those, but in any one area, there's only 2 or 3 or 4. So worldwide, there are lots of different Anopheles species that transmit malaria, but in any one place, 1, 2, 3, 4 will be transmitting 99% of the malaria. And their behavior differs in fascinating ways. And the key variables are their breeding behavior, where do the females go to lay their eggs, and what opportunity for control does that give you, and the biting behavior. When and where and who do they bite? Are they anthropophilic, i.e. preferring to bite humans? Are they endophilic, preferring to bite indoors? Or are they exophilic, preferring to bite out of doors? Do they bite primarily in the evening, dusk and dawn? The classic malaria vector, Anopheles gambii, that is responsible for most transmission in Africa, is highly anthropophilic, likes humans, highly endophilic, it bites indoors, and it bites between dusk and dawn. So you know where to get it, you know where to stop it, you know where to intervene. But in other parts of the world, those things may not be true. The vectors may be promiscuous feeders. A cow today, a human tomorrow, a dog on Thursday. It's all nice warm blood to me. They may bite earlier in the evening. Bad news. People haven't gone to bed yet. They can't be under their mosquito nets. They're out and about. More difficult to control, and so on. So those differences are really important, and a starting point for control is know your anopheline vector. And know her particularly. You're not so interested in him, you're interested in her. Where is she laying her eggs and where is she biting? Where and when and who is she biting? And that is known in exquisite detail. This is how entomologists spend their lives. They know a lot about this, and you need to know that. So that makes the interventions somewhat different in different parts of the world. Now, the details of this progress towards elimination vary enormously in different parts of the world. Nobody declared being from Vanuatu, so I won't dwell on Vanuatu. And no one declared being from the Solomon Islands, although I will mention, for the historians of war here, you will know that this island here, the largest island of the Solomon Islands, is Guadalcanal. And Guadalcanal was one of the biggest and bloodiest fights of the Second World War and was the turning point. It was the first US victory over the Japanese on land. And more Marines and Japanese antagonists were killed from malaria than from being shot or blown up. So malaria had a devastating impact on that campaign. For those of you who want a gripping account of that, read the book called The Guadalcanal Diaries by what today we would call an embedded journalist. That phrase didn't exist in 1943, but today we would call it an embedded journalist from the New York Times who was with the Marines on Guadalcanal. But we do have people here from the Philippines, do we not? So let's look at the Philippines. Yes, hello. So remarkable progress. The Philippines used to be malarious everywhere. All islands of the Philippines used to have malaria. Today, the Philippines looks like this. There are significant malaria-free zones shown in green in the Philippines because of very persistent and successful work over the last 20 years by the Philippine government. And the Philippines is moving progressively, district by district, island by island, to eliminate. They have a grand plan. And by and large, with some ups and downs and some setbacks, that grand plan is moving ahead successfully. I like to mention this example because there is so much focus on the good news and bad news from Africa. We have to remember a lot of other people in the world suffer from malaria. And there's some really good work and some really good progress going on a long way from Africa. And the Philippines is one striking example. Now, of course, the Mindanao and other parts of the Philippines where there is still tension, insurgency, instability, will prove the most difficult. Because, as I said before, instability and war are the great enemies of malaria control. And so that will be tough. One of the things that we at UCSF are doing is catalyzing and supporting regional collaborations for malaria elimination, making structures whereby the elimination countries can come together, collaborate, share science, share experience, and help each other. And one of these is the Asia-Pacific Malaria Elimination Network, which was launched by Kevin Rudd, the Australian Prime Minister, gets a lot of support from the Australian government, and is working on collaborative elimination across the region. The members are Bhutan, China, both Koreas, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, the Philippines. There are 10 member countries. Here they are all listed, if I forgot one. And they're working together on their common problems, and particularly Plasmodium vivax, the second major human species, which is particularly difficult to deal with when you're trying to eliminate. The end game against Plasmodium vivax is particularly challenging. So we're very pleased with this collaboration, and there's much excitement about it in those countries. And a collaborative science and policy sharing work program is getting underway, and I think will bring a lot of benefits to the region. And of course, eventually, other countries will join. India is already saying, why aren't we a member? We want to eliminate. So it creates a momentum just by the existence of the collaboration. Sri Lanka is a very interesting case. Sri Lanka came within a whisker of eliminating in 1964. Sri Lanka is the classic example of the country that almost did it and then lost it completely. They were within a whisker of elimination. They turned their back. There weren't many malaria cases. They said, okay, job done, run down the program, let go the people, move the budget somewhere else, and whoosh, malaria came back. Millions of cases a year. They're now almost there again. They're very, very close to elimination, despite the war, even with the war. Now the war is over, they're even closer. And we just heard the other day that the residual problem is not in the refugee camps that are proven so controversial. There is no malaria, apparently, in the refugee camps. It's with soldiers stationed in the forests in the jungle areas. There are military still out and about in the forests, and they are the residual malaria foci. And working with them is proving quite difficult because they move around and get constantly re-exposed. But I think Sri Lanka is probably very close to finishing the job again for a second time. And then the challenge will be to maintain the malaria program even though there's no malaria, which you always have to do, otherwise it will come back. You have to maintain vigilance. Another very interesting regional collaboration is Southern Africa. The 2009 border of malaria in Southern Africa is as shown roughly on this slide. So south of that black dotted line, there is no malaria. There used to be. Lesotho pretty much never had it. Reason, high and dry. Interesting factoid, which you'll need in a Trivial Pursuits game. Lesotho has the highest lowest point of any country in the world. I'll say that again, you have to think about it. Lesotho has the highest lowest point of any country in the world. That's one reason it doesn't have malaria. Everyone says, can't be true, must be Tibet, must be Bolivia, but no, it's Lesotho. That's the highest lowest point of any country in the world. But Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, and Swaziland are malarious countries. They used to be very malarious countries. The border of malaria now runs here. There is malaria to the north and not to the south of that line, roughly speaking. And those 4 countries have committed to elimination by 2015. So they are embarked on an elimination strategy working together by 2015. In other words, quickly. By 2015, we expect the border to run, therefore, where it's now shown. And the next eliminators will be Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. Then it will be their turn. The malaria border is moving northwards. And to assist that process, and now we see 2025, entirely speculative. It probably won't be a smooth curve like that. It will probably bounce up and down depending on the circumstances in those 4 countries. But those 8 countries now, the 4 blue ones and the 4 green ones, have come together to form the E8, the Elimination 8, working in tandem on malaria elimination, particularly the cross-border issues, because cross-border really matters. If you're not collaborating with your neighbors, you're going to be re-importing malaria all the time. So cross-border becomes very important. The 2009 map of the world, shown a bit differently, looks like this. The green countries have eliminated no malaria. We talked about those before. There are 100 of those. Malaria has been eliminated already today in 100 countries. That leaves 100 countries, if you think there are roughly 200 countries in the world, which there are, that leaves 100 countries still with malaria. They are red and blue. The blue are the eliminators, there are 39 of those, and the red are the controllers, there are 61 of those. So the controllers are still in the hard work of pushing it down, reducing morbidity or reducing mortality, and the blue countries are going for the end game, they're trying to get rid of it. By 2020, some of them will have succeeded, some of them will not, but even the ones that haven't succeeded completely, I predict will have made very significant progress on that road to elimination. And of course, as a country eliminates, it passes the baton to its neighbor, because this is a spatially progressive process. We are shrinking the malaria map. If you're surrounded by malarious countries, don't think of elimination. Unless you have a very big wall around your country, you're not going to do it if you're surrounded. You need to be on the edge, like Mexico. Then you can do it. So that's the world in 2009. The world in 2015 may look like this. More green countries malaria-free, and that lurid pink illustrates, or mauve or whatever it is, that illustrates still have malaria, but it's not bright red anymore, indicating that the control programs have brought it right down. We haven't stood still in the heartland, we've continued to control, and therefore there's much less malaria than there was in those areas. And then 2025, a prediction something like this, that may be optimistic. It depends on a number of factors, including political factors. I mean, if you've been watching Zimbabwe on this map, the political dimensions of that will be very obvious to you. So those of you who want to know more about this subject, I recommend these two reports. If you want to know a lot about it, I recommend the one on the right, a prospectus on malaria elimination. I have one copy of that at the front for anyone who wants to grab it. And for those of you who want to know something about it, but not too much, then there is the report on the left, the guide for policymakers, and I have 10 of those sitting at the front for anyone who would like to take them. They're all available on the website of the Malaria Elimination Group, which we convene, which is malariaeliminationgroup.org. So not hard to remember. Well, the question was about the use of bed nets, and let me use that to come back to the question from our colleague from Ethiopia. How has this been done? I mean, what are the strategies? And the short answer is there are attacks on the mosquito and there are attacks on the parasite. The attacks on the mosquito are threefold, two of which we use widely and one of which we use very selectively. The attacks on the mosquito are firstly insecticide-treated bed nets. So these are the new bed nets, the so-called long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets. You could give up, actually. Yeah, okay.
Both the ones we have in there. So.
Yeah, I don't know where it's gone.
So,
the long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets, this is a great new technology invented by Sumitomo Chemical, the Japanese company, in which the insecticide is built into the fabric before the net is even made. So the insecticide is actually in the fabric. If you go to REI, you can now buy camping shirts and trousers made with the same technical process. You can get insecticide impregnated clothing. And this is not done by taking a shirt and dipping it in insecticide and drying it on the line. This is done by building the insecticide molecules into the fibers before the shirt is actually made. So this is a great new technology, and it's now the main way of making bed nets. So for $5, you buy a bed net whose insecticidal properties last for about 5 years, so $1 a year. And that net gives a high degree of protection to those who sleep under it, because it's not just a physical barrier. In the old days, I'm sure all of you have used simple untreated bed nets. There, it's just a physical barrier. And when you sleep under that physical barrier, you are a bait. The female Anopheles knows you're there. And she will probe. If you sleep under a mosquito net and just watch what the mosquitoes are doing, they know you're there. They know the blood meal is there. And therefore, they're doing this questing behavior. You can see them do it. They go, try, 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 try. Can I get underneath? And they'll sometimes find a way. There may be a little tear, a little hole. They'll find it and come through. Or you may not have tucked the net in adequately around your bed. Or if you sleep on a mat on the floor, if you don't have a bed, and most people in the world don't sleep on a bed, they sleep on some kind of a mat or platform on the floor, there's nowhere to tuck it in. So the mosquito can find a route underneath that. If you have an insecticide-treated net, it's a quite different situation, because the mosquito is actively repelled by the insecticide, and if the mosquito touches the net, as she does when she probes, then she may well be killed or at least wounded by the contact with the insecticide on the net. So that's the first attack on the mosquito. Insecticide-treated nets, highly effective and being used on a huge scale now around the world. Millions and millions of nets being distributed. The second attack on the mosquito is indoor residual spraying, IRS, where you spray a thin film of long-lasting insecticide on the interior walls of all rooms in which people sleep. If your mosquito is indoor biting and between dusk and dawn, then you want to spray the inside of rooms in which people sleep, the walls. It's called indoor residual spraying. It can be done with a number of insecticides, but the most effective is DDT, and increasingly widely used today is DDT. Approved by the World Health Organization, approved by the convention in Stockholm that is the sort of global guardian of the use of potentially hazardous chemicals. And the reason it's approved is several-fold. There are no documented adverse human health consequences, firstly. Secondly, the volumes used in malaria control are tiny. It's not like using DDT in agriculture, where huge volumes were used in the past and are now illegal almost everywhere. The volumes used are very small, and thirdly, the benefits are enormous. It's one of the most potent anti-malaria strategies. The third anti-mosquito strategy is to get at the breeding site. If the breeding sites are the kind of site that I can do something about, then why wouldn't I do something about it? So, for instance, I might drain the swamp or the puddles or the ponds or the whatever it is. I might do drainage. I might put Gambusia fish in the village water tanks. Those of you who know South Asia know that many villages have water tanks with guts, those steps going down into the tanks. I might put a certain kind of fish in the tank to eat the mosquito larvae. Various things I might do. In some parts of the world that doesn't work. It doesn't work in Africa because the main vector is Anopheles gambii, and Anopheles gambii will breed in any small transient body of water. The classic example is the flooded hoof print. So if your vector can breed in a flooded hoof print, what are you going to do? You can't really get rid of every flooded hoof print. In the rainy season, with animals about, you're going to have a lot of flooded hoof prints. So it depends where you are, it depends what your vector is. So those are the three main approaches against the vector. The first two of them, the mosquito net and the indoor spraying, are together highly effective and bring down mosquito populations and the rate of biting enormously. Question at the back? Poverty is the partner for malaria. So everywhere that you look, malaria is worst in poor communities, particularly poor rural communities. So there's a very strong correlation between poverty and malaria. And the corollary of that is that as communities get more wealthy, even if you did nothing, malaria would go down, because people live in better houses, they have mosquito screens on their windows and doors, they have personal ways to protect themselves. They're more likely to be conscious of malaria, get their child treated early rather than late, etc., etc. So as education rises and income levels rise, malaria can be expected to go down, even if you're doing nothing else. And that's true within countries and between countries. In the United States, where was the last battle? In the rural areas of the Southeast. That's the poorest part of the United States. It's where the poor people were. In Europe, where was the last victory? In Greece and southern Italy. That was the poorest part of Europe. So where income levels are lowest, that will be where malaria hangs on longest. And where income levels rise, malaria will tend to go down, absolutely. Finishing the story quickly if I can, then I'll come back to you. We have the 3 attacks on the vector, and we also have the attacks on the parasite. I said there were 2 ways to attack malaria. You can attack the mosquito, or you can attack the parasite. Attacking the parasite is all about prompt diagnosis and treatment. So it's all about, this child has a fever, this adult is feeling unwell, let me diagnose quickly and accurately, and let me treat effectively. And if I do that, I not only cure that individual, I stop that child dying, I send that adult back to work feeling fine in a day or 2, because we have very effective treatments, but I also reduce transmission, because that child or that adult are not around in the community with the parasite that can be passed to the mosquito and passed on to someone else. So prompt diagnosis and treatment is the key weapon against the parasite. And we now have rapid diagnostic tests that are much easier to use, and we have much better anti-malaria drugs. We started with chloroquine. We got widespread resistance to chloroquine. We moved to a drug called Fansidar. We got widespread resistance to Fansidar, and we've now moved to artemisinin combination therapy, the drug of choice in nearly every country around the world. 3 days, very effective, morning, evening, morning, evening, morning, evening, no adverse side effects, highly effective cure, and based on an ancient Chinese herbal medicine. So one of these rare but very pleasing examples of taking a cure out of traditional medicine wisdom, in this case Chinese traditional medical wisdom, and working out what the active ingredient in the sweet wormwood, as we call it in the West, the Artemita shrub. It actually grows in my garden in Alameda. It's very easy to grow. Finding out what the active ingredient called artemisinin in the leaves of that shrub is, purifying that, and then making that a drug in combination with another drug. That's why it's called artemisinin combination therapy. It's the artemisinin plus something else. That's become the drug of choice all around the world. So that's the attack on the parasite. And other key ingredients, just to finish the whole picture, other key ingredients of successful elimination are really about surveillance. They're really about your intelligence. You need to know what the malaria is doing, who's infected, where they are, where are the outbreaks, where are the foci. You need a lot of intelligence, you need a lot of vigilance, because then you can act strenuously where transmission is still occurring. So that's a sort of an overview of how this is done in individual countries. For over 30 years, there has been scientific work on the malaria vaccine. And for 20 years, certainly, there's been this, we're going to get one soon, we're going to get one soon, we're going to get one soon, but it's receded and receded and receded. For the first time in history, it's now actually true. We're going to get one soon. So in 3 or 4 years, and if I'm wrong, I'll eat my hat or something, in 3 or 4 years, we will have a vaccine that's gone through phase 3 trials, which are going on in Africa today. It'll be made by GlaxoSmithKline, and it's the product of a lot of basic laboratory research. It will be scientifically a major step forward, but it will have limited efficacy. We don't know how much yet. As I think most people know, the vaccines that we're used to have 90% plus efficacy. We vaccinate against polio, 90% plus efficacy. measles, whooping cough, etc., H1N1, all these vaccines that we know and love and use have 90% plus efficacy. This will be a vaccine, the malaria vaccine will be a vaccine with a 50% efficacy, or a 45, or a 55. We don't know. We have to wait for the outcome of the phase 3 trials. But that's the ballpark. That raises very difficult strategic questions. Who would use such a vaccine? At what cost? To vaccinate whom? Children, adults? How would you? A lot of big questions. And we don't have a global experience with that. We haven't had a global experience of what to do with a 50% efficacious vaccine. That's a new kind of weapon in our armamentarium. So there's a lot of policy debate right now about when we get it, how will we use it? Where will be the priorities for the application of this vaccine? I think scientifically the important message is this vaccine is a stepping stone. By making this vaccine, we learn a lot about the immunology of malaria, and we'll then get a better vaccine. The other point to remember about vaccines is that it's very hard to make a vaccine that is better than nature. The reason that our measles vaccine is so good is that if you get measles as a child, you're immune for life. And if you get polio as a child, you're immune for life. So nature immunizes you. If you get hepatitis A, you're immune for life. So to make a vaccine that mimics nature is not so difficult. That's why we've made so many vaccines and we can make them so quickly. But malaria doesn't immunize for life or anything close to that. If you're a child in rural Malawi, you're almost constantly infected by malaria. You're infected and reinfected and reinfected and reinfected. So the first years of your life, you're living with the Plasmodium parasite. And your immune system has the maximum opportunity to develop its defenses. As an adult, malaria can't kill you. Did you grow up in Kenya, or did you grow up in a rural area or an urban area? Peri-urban, okay. So if you were much exposed to Plasmodium in your childhood, you become a semi-immune adult, very unlikely to be killed. So back in Kenya, I could be killed in a few days. But if you met the parasite often as a child, you would be very unlikely to die of malaria. But it can make you ill. And you see adult cases quite frequently. And people feel lousy and they don't go to work for a week. And then they feel better and then they go back to work. So we know that even heavy exposure of the immune system to the parasite does not produce a lifelong immunity. It produces some partial immunity, some protection. And that's a real warning sign for the vaccine makers, because doing better than nature is pretty tough, pretty tough. So that's the challenge. But we will get a vaccine. We will learn from it. We will use it somewhere. I don't quite know how. That's being debated. And then science will move on and make a better vaccine and a better vaccine. Whether a vaccine will ever be kind of the cornerstone of our efforts, I don't know. I don't know. Well, where are the funding gaps? They're substantial. I mentioned that funding has gone up a lot at the beginning, but in terms of implementing the aggressive control programs in the heartland, we still have significant funding gaps. If you look at the very large African countries like DRC and Nigeria, I mean, those two countries, DR Congo and Nigeria, those two countries alone represent a high proportion of all the malaria in Africa because they're such large and populous countries. And for them to fully fund what they need to do, there's still significant gaps. So we have those gaps. But we also have gaps on the research front still, which need to be filled. The role of the private sector is absolutely critical. And I'll give two quick dimensions to that. One is the private sector in the sense of what goes on in the Bay Area, the biotechnology industry and the pharmaceutical industry. We're not going to get the next drug or the better vaccine or the next vaccine or the better diagnostic if the private sector is not fully engaged. The upstream discoveries can come out of a laboratory at UCSF. They often do. But taking that discovery down the long, rocky road of R&D to eventual licensing and mass distribution around the world, that is something that the industry is good at and that the public labs essentially don't do. It's not their competence. So we need the industry, the biotech industry and the big pharma industry, who have done a lot and are doing more. Companies like Novartis, Sanofi Aventis, GSK are major players in malaria products. The other way that we need the private sector is out in the developing countries. If you pose the question, can the government do all of this? The answer is typically no. You need a strong government program, but you need your non-government actors to be active. And a great example is the mining industry in some countries. A number of countries where the mining industry has taken on malaria, initially for self-interest. It's killing my workers, it's causing high absenteeism, I want to stop that. It's good for my bottom line to have a healthy workforce. So companies have imposed kind of cordons sanitaires. They've created malaria-free zones around their mine or oil field or whatever it happens to be. And then they've found, hey, people love us if we do this. This is really good public relations in the country and environment where I'm working. So why don't I keep expanding outwards? And there are some wonderful examples. The gold mining industry in Ghana, the aluminium industry in Mozambique, the mining industry generally in Botswana and South Africa, where major private companies have taken on this task. Papua New Guinea, another very good example, and are creating expanding circles of malaria freedom, initially for their own interests, but increasingly to play a role for the community. And you could go on with these examples. I mean, take Botswana. The malaria in Botswana and the tourists in Botswana are all in the same place. The malaria is all in the north, in the Okavango Delta, and the tourists are all in the north, in the Okavango Delta. So you've got a complete mapping of tourists and malaria, not popular among the tourists or among the tourist industry. So there are discussions underway to try and get the tourist industry more engaged in malaria control. So many opportunities to do that. Let me interpret that as this sort of critical question that's coming up time and time again of how do we balance our focus on specific diseases, AIDS, TB, malaria, diarrhea, pneumonia, sometimes characterized as a vertical approach, not a phrase that I like to use, with a focus on building health systems, strengthening the fabric, our ability to deliver whatever needs to be delivered, which is sometimes characterized as a horizontal approach. This is a debate that's gone on for 20 years. I think a lot of people in the business thought that we'd settled it, that we'd all basically agreed on a diagonal approach, and we were kind of all leaning at 45 degrees, and no one was lying down horizontally, and no one was standing up vertically, and we kind of got over this. But in Washington today, this kind of dichotomy and this kind of competitive spirit almost between the health systems advocates and the disease advocates has come back on the table. So I think it's become a current debate again. My view, and we had a lot of experiences of this at the Global Fund because we were the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, so very specific goals, was that these two goals are highly complementary. They're not competitive. That if you invest effectively in malaria, your investments will be polyvalent and they will strengthen the health system. You will strengthen laboratories, which will do all kinds of things. You will employ more staff. You will train more doctors and nurses. You will increase your surveillance systems. You'll improve your supply chain. Supply chain is one of the nightmares in many low-income countries. And if you're fixing your supply chain to get malaria drugs out there, that supply chain won't say, oh, sorry, can't take the pneumonia drugs, we're a malaria supply chain. I mean, no one thinks like that. That supply chain will deliver everything that needs to be delivered to that clinic. So these investments, if well made, are polyvalent. And I think that's the key element, and they should be. And the funders, like the Global Fund, should encourage that polyvalence of investment. Meanwhile, there needs to be serious attention to the real fabric and design of the healthcare system. Because as we see today in the United States, There is no agreement on what the healthcare system should look like, how it should be financed, how it should be provided, the role of the public sector, the role of the private sector. It's as true in Tanzania as it is in the United States that these policy issues are not resolved. There is not agreement among the political parties. There is not a wide consensus or understanding among the voting public. And those things do need to be clarified and agreed, and then systematic long-term efforts to get the financing side and the provider side into good shape, which, as you know, in low-income countries, neither of those things are in good shape, neither the finance nor the provision nor the infrastructure that underpins both. The long-term effort of building those can proceed. So I think both areas of investment are important. And I don't in any way think, I think for those who say that disease-specific investments somehow undermine health system strengthening, my experience is that the opposite is the case. Well-done disease-specific investments strengthen the health system. So it's my short answer. But the other things you mentioned, the clinics that can treat everything else, the water supplies, the sanitation, all these other things really matter and require attention. And it's a long-term task. Can I thank everyone very much? And,